Her voice was fragile, almost breaking through the static of the microphone. Melania's words trembled out into the silence of the room, slipping past the walls her image handlers had built for years. And then there it was. A confession, half-whispered, but undeniable. The kind of sentence that instantly pulls oxygen out of the air. The cameras didn't catch her polished smile, the model grace, or the careful rehearsed gestures this time. Instead, they caught a flicker of fear, a shadow that spoke louder than her words. The audience leaned in, the chatter online erupted, and one thought seized the collective mind. Did she just admit that? About him, the moment didn't need fact-checkers, it didn't need translation. It was raw. For years, the facade of a perfect gilded marriage had been paraded before America like a trophy. But now the mask slipped. And when masks slip, heroes step in. Entered Jasmine Crockett, her eyes locked onto the screen as if she could stare straight through the lies, through the carefully polished surfaces of power. That glorit wasn't just anger. It was the fury of every woman silenced, every immigrant told to smile and endure. Every ordinary person who'd been told to stay quiet when the powerful did harm. Crockett didn't flinch. While others gasped. While pundits scrambled to fill airtime with nervous speculation, Jasmine leaned forward, sharpened by purpose. The room seemed to bend toward her, the energy changing, suspense thickening like a storm about to break. Because this wasn't just a private slip-up. This was the first crack in a fortress built on intimidation and silence. And Jasmine Crockett knew exactly how to turn that crack into an earthquake. The irony cut deep. For years, Trump had strutted across the stage, selling strength, projecting dominance, dismissing critics with the flick of a hand. But in a single trembling confession, his empire of bravado shook. And standing across from that weakness was a woman unafraid to call it what it was. What happened next wasn't rehearsed. Wasn't staged, that was raw, electric. For decades, Donald Trump has operated with one
Millions were
chilling
watching,
consistency.
millions were
Silence
waiting.
the women. The stories stretch back like a dark ledger, etched with intimidation, non-disclosure agreements, and the heavy hand of hush money. Pageants, boardrooms, hotel suites each, one carrying whispers that were quickly smothered under the weight of lawyers, threats, or payouts. He perfected the art of burying truth beneath gold-plated distractions, building an empire not only on real estate but on fear. Every lawsuit that vanished into settlement. Every woman who came forward only to be mocked, ridiculed, or dragged through the mud. Every headline that flickered for a moment before being drowned in another Trump spectacle. He knew the formula. When the powerful man sneers, when the machine attacks, most women retreat. Silence became his most effective weapon. And in all of this storm, Melania stood as the quietest figure of all. Her silence wasn't just noticeably, was defining. The carefully neutral expressions, the rehearsed grace at rallies, the robotic smiles beside him. For years, people speculated, was she trapped? Was she complicit? Did she know more than she let on? The silence kept the mystery alive, but it also kept Trump shielded. Because as long as Melania never spoke, he could sell. The illusion of loyalty, of marital unity, of power that stretched into his own household. That's why her trembling words cut deeper than any lawsuit or tabloid headline ever could. This wasn't another accuser. This wasn't a protester or a political rival. This was her. The woman he paraded on his arm, the symbol of his supposed family values, the one person the public assumed would never break ranks. And in a single unguarded moment, her voice carried more weight than years of legal battles combined. Right. Because when the silent finally speak, the world listens. And that's exactly what Jasmine Crockett understood. In Congress, Crockett is built. Her reputation not on politeness, not on playing the game, but on piercing through the fog of power with unapologetic clarity. She is a truth-teller in a chamber that often rewards evasions. When men twice her age thundered at her, she didn't flinch, she fired back. When billionaires hid behind corporate jargon, she cut their arguments down to size. When Trump's defenders cloaked his misdeeds in excuses, she named them for what they were. Abuse of power, plain and simple. Crockett's strength lies in her refusal to bend. Where others calculate political safety, she calculates impact. And now, in this moment, with Melania's fragile confession hanging in the air, Jasmine saw exactly what was at stake. This wasn't just another scandal. This was history knocking on the door. Because Trump's empire had always relied on control. Control of the media cycle. Control of his allies. Control of the women in his life. The second Melania's voice cracked through that armor, the illusion faltered, and Crockett with her. Relentless determination was not going to let that illusion rebuild itself. She knew millions of women, immigrants, and working families were watching. Watching to see if anyone would name what they felt in their bones. Watching. To see if this moment of truth would be buried like all the rest, or if someone would finally hold the line. What unfolded when these two forces collided, the reluctant confession from a silenced wife, and the unflinching fire of a congresswoman, unafraid of power, wasn't just political theater, it was the spark of something larger. Something historic. Because when Jasmine seized that moment, the air shifted, and the eruption that followed would shake the country to its core. Donald Trump has always cast himself as the ultimate showman. The gilded lobbies, the oversized gold letters stamped across buildings. The reality TV boardroom where he relished firing people with a smirk, it was all part of the character he sold to America. A titan of business. A man who took what he wanted and dared anyone to stop him. A patriarch who bragged about his family as trophies of his empire. To millions, he was larger than life, untouchable. But behind that gleaming mask, another story was always waiting. Story whispered by women, by workers, by those who had seen him without the cameras rolling. And those whispers painted not a titan, but a predator. For decades, accusations followed him like a shadow he could never quite outrun. Women who competed in his pageants described being paraded, ogled, and barged in on while half-dressed. Former employees recounted humiliations and threats, lawsuits silenced with payoffs. The infamous Access Hollywood tape was not an outlier, it was a glimpse into a pattern. A window into a man who believed that power granted him permission to do anything, to anyone. Yet somehow, Trump always spun the narrative. He dismissed his accusers as liars, framed lawsuits as nuisances. He mocked women's appearances, reducing them to punchlines, while simultaneously preaching that no one respected women more than he did. The arrogance was breathtaking using the language of respect while acting with open contempt. The mask versus the reality. He wrapped himself in the language of family values, campaigning beside Melania and their son as though they were proof of his virtue. He promised to defend the sanctity of the American family, even as his own family life was riddled with scandal. Affairs splashed across tabloids, hush money funneled to silence adult film stars, accusations of cruelty behind closed doors. Emperor draped himself in morality, while the truth revealed no clothes at all. The hypocrisy was almost operatic. He claimed to fight for forgotten Americans, yet stiffed contractors who built his casinos. He declared himself a champion of the law, yet bragged about skirting taxes and dodging accountability. He positioned himself as the voice of the silenced, even as he used his fortune to silence women who dared to speak against him. Each contradiction widened the chasm between the myth and the man. Still, Trump thrived on audacity. He knew that if he acted as though he was invincible, enough people would believe him. He turned press conferences into theater, scandals into ratings, even impeachment into a badge of honor. His genius was not in truth, but in performance. And in performance. The mask was everything. But masks crack. Every emperor who believes himself clothed in invulnerability eventually faces the mirror. For Trump, those cracks appeared in the women he tried hardest to dismiss. Every lawsuit settled in secrecy was a fissure. Every insult hurled at an accuser only deepened the suspicion that he feared them. And with Melania, the stakes were even higher. Because Melania wasn't a stranger, wasn't an outsider, wasn't a protester on the street. She was the woman who stood silently at his side through campaigns and scandals alike. The one he displayed as proof of his stability. If even she let the mask slip, if even she broke the silence. Then the emperor's nudity could no longer be denied. Trump's arrogance always told him that control was permanent, that as long as he blustered, threatened, and distracted, the truth would stay buried. But arrogance has limits. Arrogance convinces a man that betrayal is impossible, that silence is eternal, that masks never crack. And yet, arrogance has a way of cracking, sometimes from the inside. Before the glare of congressional lights, before the cameras hung on her every word, Jasmine Crockett was a fighter cut from a different cloth. Born and raised in Texas, she grew up watching her community wrestle with inequality that was never just abstract policy, it was daily life. Families pushed down by the system, women silenced in courtrooms, immigrants told they didn't belong. Where others saw inevitability, Jasmine saw injustice. And she decided early on that she wouldn't just watch it happen. She would stand. In the way, her path led her to the law, not because she craved prestige, but because she saw it as a weapon for the powerless. In her early legal battles, she wasn't defending billionaires or chasing flashy headlines. She was standing beside those who had no one else, families facing eviction, women escaping abuse, black and brown communities targeted by discriminatory policing. Every case hardened her resolve. Every courtroom defeat taught her to sharpen her arguments. Every victory reminded her why the fight mattered. Crockett quickly became known not just as a lawyer, but as a presence. Sharp, relentless, unafraid to make the powerful uncomfortable. She wasn't the kind of attorney who smoothed edges or negotiated away dignity for convenience. She fought. And in a system built to exhaust people into silence, that fight made her dangerous. So, when she entered politics, she didn't arrive as a careerist searching for compromise. She entered as a warrior with scars, a truth-teller forged in battle. And Washington, with all its polished rhetoric and backroom deals, didn't quite know what to do with her. In hearing after hearing, Crockett proved herself unshakable. When Republicans tried to bulldoze her with volume, she answered with precision. When Trump allies attempted to spin falsehoods, she shredded them with facts delivered like arrows. She didn't raise her voice to match theirs. She used her words like scalpels, cutting through the theater to expose the raw hypocrisy beneath. Clips of her sharp comebacks ricocheted across social media, turning her into a symbol of fearless truth-telling. 4 marginalized women watching at home, 4 immigrants tired of being scapegoated, 4 communities weary of being dismissed. Jasmine's fire was fuel, but it wasn't just the spectacle. What made her different was that every blow she landed in Congress came from a place of lived empathy. She wasn't sparring for ego, wasn't performing for television soundbites. She was channeling the voices of those long-silenced women who never got their day in court, families who never saw justice, victims whose pain had been laughed off by men in power. For them, Jasmine Crockett was not just a congresswoman. She was an advocate who refused to look away. She didn't come to Washington to be polite. One supporter famously said, "She came to tell the truth," and that truth often came at a cost. The powerful don't like being confronted, and Crockett's unapologetic style earned her enemies. But unlike so many before her, she didn't shrink. She leaned into the fight. Knowing full well that progress is never handed over willingly, it's seized. Her rise was not an accident. It was the product of discipline, clarity, and a moral compass that pointed unwaveringly toward justice. In a political world where compromise is currency, she chose conviction instead. That conviction was about to matter more than ever. Because while Trump's mask began to slip, it was Crockett who stood ready to hold it in her hands and show the world what lay beneath. Her past had prepared her for this moment. The courtroom battles against abusive systems, the fiery debates in Congress, the scars of standing up when silence would have been easier, they all converged here. Every skill, every ounce of courage, every refusal to bend was about to be tested. The room was thick with expectation, every eye fixed on the unlikely witness whose words had already shaken the ground. Melania sat poised, but her hands betrayed her, the faint tremor of fingers pressing into one another, the tightness of her jaw. She had been silent for years, sculpted into an ornament of compliance. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't about to let her slip back into silence. Crockett leaned in, her tone calm but unyielding. "Mrs. Trump, you've been asked these questions before, and every time you've declined to answer. 8. But tonight, 2 words are already out there. So let's not dance around them. Did you mean what you said?" The air tensed. Melania shifted in her chair, eyes darting toward the rows of Trump allies seated like sentinels. One of them a congressman eager to prove his loyalty. Immediately, this is out of order. She doesn't have to dignify these politically motivated attacks with an answer. Crockett didn't even blink. "Respectfully," she said, cutting through his bluster like glass. "This isn't about politics. This is about truth. And the American people deserve to hear it." A low ripple of approval stirred in the audience. The defenders bristled. Another ally chimed in, barking about witch hunts and media bias. But Crockett raised her hand slightly, the gesture steady, commanding the attention of the room. "You can shout all you want," she said, her voice firm. "But shouting won't erase what was already spoken. Mrs. Trump's voice deserves to be heard without interruption." Melania's lips parted, then closed again. The tension in her face was visible, a battle between loyalty and liberation. Crockett leaned forward, softening her tone without losing edge. "I'm not asking you to repeat rumors, not asking you to perform for cameras. I'm asking you, woman to woman, when you spoke those words, were you telling the truth?" The silence stretched, cough from the back row, the shuffle of papers. Every second felt like a rope pulled tighter around the room. Melania's eyes flicked downward, then back up. As if calculating the cost of honesty against the weight of fear, Trump's allies scrambled again. "This is harassment," one shouted. "She owes no explanation." But the audience wasn't buying it. People leaned forward, whispering, clutching their phones, recording every twitch of Melania's expression. The tide had shifted, and Crockett had seized control. Mrs. Trump, Jasmine pressed, her voice low but resonant. "You've been silent for so long, and silence only protects the powerful. But I promise you, if you choose truth today, you're not standing alone. Millions of women know what it means to be afraid. Millions know what it means to be silenced. And millions are waiting to hear if you'll stand with them now." The words hung heavy. Melania's throat tightened as she swallowed, visibly caught between 2 worlds, the fear of retaliation and the hunger for release. Her hand lifted, brushing her hair back, but her eyes glistened with something rawer than composure. A gasp spread through the crowd as she leaned toward the microphone. Even the defenders, suddenly unsure, fell quiet. This was the edge of revelation, the place where performance ended and humanity began. It came barely louder than a breath, fragile as glass, the kind of whisper that made the front rows lean forward to make sure they hadn't misheard. Melania's lips moved slowly, each word dragged out of her as though against her will. "He beats me every day." The silence that followed was suffocating. For a second, no one dared breathe. The words seemed too impossible, too dangerous to belong in that space. Yet they were out there now, floating in the heavy air, echoing louder than any shout. 1,000 memories of her careful smiles, her averted glances. Her scripted speeches suddenly snapped into place like shards of a broken mirror. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A woman in the back clasped her hand over her mouth. Phones jolted upward, recording in shaky hands. The whispers started small. "Did she just say?" Then swelled into a current of disbelief rushing from row to row, and then, before anyone could deny it, before defenders could leap to their feet to drown it out, Melania straightened slightly and repeated herself louder this time, her accent sharpening the edges of every word. "He beats me every day." The eruption was instantaneous. Murmurs crashed into gasps, shock splintered into outrage. Trump's defenders scrambled, half standing, hands waving, faces pale. A lawyer at the side table nearly knocked over his briefcase, fumbling through papers as if some contract or clause could undo what had just been said. Jasmine Crockett did not move. She didn't flinch. She sat perfectly still, eyes locked on Melania, with a calm so commanding it quieted the chaos. In an invisible radius around her, And then, in a voice deliberate and steady, she spoke into her microphone. "Madam Clerk." "Let the record reflect clearly," she said, each syllable like a gavel striking wood. "Mrs. Melania Trump has just stated twice that Donald J. Trump, the former President of the United States, beats her every day." The room roared with gasps. Trump's allies leaped to their feet, shouting objections, spitting accusations of slander, demanding the words be stricken. But it was too late. The moment was etched into history, seared into the feeds of millions, because outside those walls, the world was already reacting. Phones buzzed in pockets, Twitter feeds lit up with hashtags exploding across screens, hashtag MELANIA speaks, hashtag no more silence, hashtag Trump exposed. People typed in disbelief. "Oh my God, did she just say that? This is the crack we've been waiting for. Protect Melania now." The confession was no longer a fragile whisper, was a thunderclap ricocheting around the globe. Trump himself, usually a figure who thrived on control, was suddenly rattled. His face flushed crimson on the monitors, jaw tightening, lips pursed into the familiar scowl. But this time it was brittle. His attorneys swarmed, whispering frantically, their eyes darting to the cameras, calculating damage in real time. The Emperor had been stripped bare, and no amount of bluster could cover it. Meanwhile, Crockett seized the stage with the precision of someone who had been preparing her whole life for this moment. She didn't gloat. She didn't raise her voice. She did something far more devastating. She told the truth plainly. "Let us be clear," she said, her tone calm yet cutting, resonating in every corner of the chamber. "No woman should ever have to fear her husband. Not in private, not in public, not behind the locked doors of the White House, not even the First Lady of the United States." The crowd erupted in a collective gasp again, but this time it was laced with affirmation, like the release of pressure from a dam about to burst. On social media, the line was clipped within seconds, replayed endlessly, captioned in bold text, "No woman should ever have to fear her husband." Representative Jasmine Crockett. The phrase became a rallying cry, already plastered across trending threads. Destined for protest signs by morning, Trump's defenders scrambled to counterpunch. One shouted, voice cracking, "This is a setup. She's being manipulated." Another cried, "This is nothing but theater." But every excuse felt hollow, bouncing uselessly off the walls, drowned out by the reality of what had just been spoken on record. Crockett leaned in again, her voice slicing through the noise. "You can call it theater. You can call it politics. But for millions of women in this country, it's reality. Abuse is not a partisan issue. Fear is not a campaign slogan. This is about humanity." Melania sat frozen, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. She had not expected to speak, had not expected the words to leave her lips, but once spoken, they freed something in her. Crockett's steady presence seemed to anchor her, a silent promise that she was no longer alone in the storm. The tension swelled again. Each pause between Crockett's sentences weighted like a drumbeat. She looked across the room, past the defenders, past the lawyers, directly into the cameras that carried her face into millions of homes. And let's not mistake what just happened. This isn't about tabloid gossip. This is about violence against women. This is about power used to intimidate, control, and silence. And today, that silence was broken. The chamber buzzed with electricity. Every camera light burned brighter, every reporter's pen scribbled faster, every viewer at home felt their chest tighten. This was no longer a political hearing. This was a reckoning. Trump's empire had always thrived on denial, but denial was impossible now. Melania's words, Crockett's framing, the gasps and the hashtags, it was already too big, too loud, too raw to stuff back into the shadows. Crockett delivered her final blow, her voice unwavering. "History will not remember who shouted the loudest in this room today. It will remember who spoke the truth. And the truth has just been spoken." The room fell still, the defenders drained of their bluster, the lawyers sinking into their chairs. Trump himself staring blankly as though the walls were closing in. The power dynamic had shifted before the eyes of the nation. It didn't take minutes. It didn't even take seconds. The moment Melania's confession left her lips, the internet caught fire. Twitter feeds detonated in real time. Hashtags erupting across the trending bar like lightning strikes. Hashtag Melania speaks. Hashtag believer. Hashtag no more silence. Screens lit up across the globe with disbelief, heartbreak, and rage typed out in 280 characters. "Oh my God," she said it out loud. She's been silent for years. And now this. Text Melania immediately. The words echoed through timelines, amplified by retweets and stitched into TikTok reactions. Clips of Jasmine Crockett's steady voice. "No woman should ever have to fear her husband," circulated like wildfire. Set 2 dramatic soundtracks, replayed in bold captions, celebrated. As the mic drop of the decade, overnight, she wasn't just a congresswoman. She was a cultural force. Late-night hosts jumped in almost instantly, scrapping their prepared monologues to deliver blistering commentary. One opened with, "Turns out the Access Hollywood tape was just the warm-up act." The real headline came from Melania herself, laughter mixed with discomfort as audiences processed the seriousness under the jokes. Another host turned solemn, declaring, "When even the First Lady says she lives in fear, we can't pretend this is just politics anymore." Celebrities added their voices to the chorus. Actresses who had spoken out during hashtag #MeToo rallied behind. Melania calling her confession a brave act in the face of terrifying power. Pop stars retweeted Crockett's line with heart emojis and fire icons, turning it into a rallying cry for millions of young fans. Women's groups announced vigils and press conferences, promising that this moment would not fade like so many scandals before. They framed it not as Melania's shame, but as a collective fight. If the most visible woman in America could be trapped in silence, then no woman's story could be dismissed. Meanwhile, Trump's allies were scrambling. On cable news, his defenders tried to spin furiously, calling the confession a misunderstanding, blaming the stress of the hearing, even suggesting Melania had been coached or pressured into saying something she didn't mean. Her tone was desperate, almost pleading, as if they could shout loudly enough to drown out the viral clips, looping endlessly across the internet. But every denial only fueled the fire. "Gaslighting 101, one viral tweet declared, attaching a side-by-side video. Melania whispering the words, then repeating them louder, set against Trump's defenders, insisting she hadn't said what everyone had just heard. The contrast was devastating. The Emperor's mask was crumbling in real time, and no amount of spin could glue it back together. And in the center of it all stood Jasmine Crockett. Her face, her words, her composure were everywhere. Memes crowned her with fire halos, calling her the woman who spoke truth to power. Editorials labeled her the voice America didn't know it needed. Hashtags merged her name with Melania's hashtag Crockett, and Melania not as a joke, but as a symbol, the silenced and the fearless standing together, forcing the nation to confront what it wanted to ignore. For millions of women, especially immigrants and women of color, Crockett became a validation of everything they had long felt. Here was someone who didn't just survive in the lion's den of Washington, she roared. She didn't bend to the bullies, didn't soften her language, didn't flinch at power. She looked power in the eye and named its abuse. That kind of courage was contagious. Yet beneath the applause, beneath the jokes and hashtags and viral clips, something heavier pulsed. Because this wasn't just about one marriage, one scandal, or even one congresswoman. It was about every woman who had been told to smile and stay silent. Every survivor whose truth had been dismissed because the abuser was too powerful, too beloved, too untouchable. It was about the dark cost of silence and the even greater risk of breaking it. As the night stretched on, the world kept refreshing, retweeting, replaying. The headlines grew sharper, the conversations deeper, and still, one truth stood taller than the rest. This was no longer a story Trump could control. The mask was shattered, the silence broken, the reckoning undeniable. When the noise finally settled, when the hashtags slowed, when the commentators took a breath, when the cameras dimmed, Jasmine Crockett rose again. Her voice carried not the adrenaline of battle, but the calm gravity of truth. "This isn't about Melania alone," she said, her gaze sweeping the chamber as though speaking directly into the living rooms of millions. This is about every woman who has ever been silenced by power. Every woman who has swallowed her pain because she feared the consequences of honesty. Every survivor told she wouldn't be believed. The words landed not as rhetoric, but as recognition. Viewers who had whispered their own truths in the quiet of kitchens or therapy rooms suddenly felt seen. Women who had buried their stories deep felt their hearts pound as if Crockett had unlocked something they thought would never be spoken in public. She drew the contrast plainly, elegantly, unflinchingly, because here is what this moment reveals. Dignity is greater than abuse. Truth is greater than corruption. Justice is greater than intimidation. Each phrase rose higher, a rhythm like a drumbeat, a cadence that transformed the chamber into a chorus of affirmation. The camera zoomed closer. Her eyes glistened, not with weakness, but with unbreakable conviction. Power thrives on fear, she continued. Abusers thrive on silence. But when even one voice breaks free, when even one woman refuses to carry the burden of secrecy alone, the walls of intimidation begin to fall. Today, we all witness those walls crack. Across the country, women nodded, some with tears streaming, others with fists clenched in defiance. The catharsis was undeniable. Hope layered over heartbreak, resilience woven into rage. This was not just a political clash, it was a collective exhale. Proof that even against towering corruption, truth could still slice through. Crockett's presence itself became a lesson. She stood not as a celebrity, not as a polished brand, but as a resilient woman who had walked into Washington with no intention of being polite. She hadn't sought safety in compromise or hidden behind cautious language. She had carried the voices of the silenced into the halls of power and dared to speak them aloud. And in doing so, she reframed what courage looks like. It wasn't bluster or bullying or arrogance in gold towers. It was composure in the face of chaos. It was naming abuse without trembling. It was extending a hand to a woman long presumed complicit and saying, "You are not alone." By the time she finished, the moral was unmistakable. The story wasn't about Melania's pain alone, nor about Trump's crumbling mask. It was about every person trapped under the weight of intimidation. Every immigrant told they don't belong, every woman told to endure quietly. It was about the timeless battle between silence and truth, and the fact that, in the end, truth still has the power to shatter empires. Jasmine Crockett became the embodiment of that truth. It's not because she spoke louder, but because she spoke with unyielding clarity. She was proof that resilience doesn't just survive power, it challenges it, confronts it, and redefines it. And for millions watching, that resilience wasn't just hers, it was theirs. It was a shared reminder that even in a world built to silence, voices still rise. Hope swelled from the wreckage of scandal, catharsis from the tremors of confession. A new symbol had been etched into the nation's conscience, not gilded towers, not empty slogans, but a congresswoman standing tall, reminding America that the measure of power is not in domination, but in justice. In that moment, Jasmine Crockett wasn't simply a politician. She was resilient, itself unflinching, undeniable, unforgettable. And so, it happened. Jasmine Crockett forced the confession that changed everything. What began as a trembling whisper became a thunderclap across the nation. A mask decades in the making was shattered in real time, and the world saw the truth that had been hidden behind golden walls. This wasn't just a scandal. It was a lesson. Power, when left unchecked, becomes abusive. Silence, when imposed, becomes dangerous. And yet when truth is spoken, when courage stands its ground, even the most untouchable empire begins to tremble, Jasmine Crockett reminded us of something we cannot afford to forget. When power is abusive, truth is revolutionary. That is the heartbeat of progress, the spark that fuels movements, the force that topples corruption. And it does not come from the gilded halls of privilege, it comes from voices brave enough to rise, no matter how high the opposition towers above them. But here's the truth. Jasmine cannot fight alone. Melania cannot stand alone. No survivor. No advocate, no truth teller should ever be left to carry the weight by themselves. This is where we come in, where you come in. Every time you share these stories, every time you subscribe to amplify them, Every time you choose truth over silence, you become part of the community that demands justice. So don't just watch, join, subscribe, share, and stand with us. Together, we amplify the voices the powerful want silenced. Together, we remind the world that dignity will always outshine abuse, that justice will always outlast intimidation,